November 14th, May 1965. Ia Drang Valley, Central Highlands. The elephant grass rose higher than any man, undulating in patterns that appeared serene from the sky, yet concealed something timeless and watchful beneath. I was 22 years old, newly graduated from Fort Benning, wielding an M16 that still carried the scent of cosmoline and principles I hadn't yet interred in the crimson soil of Vietnam. My name held no significance then, and holds even less now. What holds significance is what we discovered during those 7 days when American forces engaged the first major confrontation against the North Vietnamese Army, when helicopters transformed the principles of warfare, and when we understood that technology and bravery don't always equal triumph. The morning began like every other at Camp Holloway in Pleiku. We'd been in country for 6 weeks, conducting patrols through settlements that observed us with expressions that disclosed nothing. The intelligence reports discussed enemy activity in the Central Highlands, about North Vietnamese regular forces moving south through Cambodia, about something developing in the mountains that nobody fully comprehended. Staff Sergeant Tommy Diaz, a compact, muscular Puerto Rican from the Bronx who'd already completed a tour in '64, had a talent for cutting through the military jargon. "They're instructing us to locate the enemy," he stated, while we maintained our rifles that morning. "Issue is, in this territory, the enemy locates you." He was correct, though none of us realized just how correct until those Huey blades started rotating at 10:30 hours. The Huey that transported us in trembled like a paint mixer, its rotor wash pressing the grass into circular designs that resembled crop circles from some extraterrestrial visit, except the only extraterrestrials here were us, descending into a terrain that had been resisting invaders for a millennium. The pilot, Warrant Officer First Class Bruce Crandall, a Texan whose hands never ceased moving across the instruments, yelled over the turbine roar, "60 seconds! Exit my aircraft!" We required no encouragement. The LZ landing zone X-ray was merely a clearing barely adequate for 3 helicopters, encircled by jungle so dense you couldn't observe 30 FT in any direction. The heat struck like opening an oven door. Not the arid heat of summer back home, but something moist and oppressive that occupied your lungs like drowning in warm bathwater. Private First Class Jimmy Nakayama, sitting opposite me in the Huey's troop compartment, had his eyes shut, not sleeping, praying. He was from Hawaii, had enlisted despite possessing a draft exemption, mentioned something about family honor, and demonstrating himself. His M16 was pristine, the most spotless weapon in the platoon, maintained every night, even when we hadn't discharged a round. Specialist 4th Class Marcus Doc Thompson, our medic, was inspecting his aid bag for the 3rd time. He was from Detroit, pre-med at Wayne State before the draft claimed him. He'd shared with me once that he'd intended to be a physician, assist people, preserve lives. "Suppose I'm still doing that," he'd said, just in the worst conceivable classroom. The helicopter descended rapidly, that stomach-dropping fall that makes you grasp for anything secure. The door gunner, a kid who appeared 16 but had to be 18, was surveying the tree line with his M60, finger on the trigger, prepared for the welcome we'd all been informed might arrive. We struck ground at precisely 10:48 hours, 12 men from each Huey, dispersing in a defensive perimeter while the subsequent bird arrived. The prop wash from the departing helicopters generated miniature dust storms that burned eyes and covered everything in red laterite soil that would never fully wash from our uniforms. Captain John Heron of Bravo Company 2nd Battalion 7th Cavalry was already positioned. He'd been in the initial lift and was establishing positions along the eastern edge of the clearing. He was career Army, had seen action, regarded us new arrivals with an expression that combined patience and worry in equal proportions. "Disperse at 50 minutes intervals. Monitor your fields of fire," he announced, his voice carrying that tone of authority that makes soldiers react before conscious thought engages. The jungle beyond the clearing edge was a barrier of green that appeared almost impenetrable. Bamboo thickets mixed with stands of teak and mahogany, the understory so thick that visibility reduced to arm's length within 10 ft of the tree line. The air beneath that canopy would be darker, cooler, saturated with sounds that signified nothing to American soldiers who trained in Georgia and California. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore, commanding the battalion, reached on the fourth lift. He was 33 years old, appeared like he could be anyone's father from anywhere in America. West Point graduate, had studied military history, comprehended tactics in ways that textbooks couldn't convey. He'd studied everything about Vietnam, consulted with French officers who'd fought here, understood we were entering something unprecedented in American military experience. "This is hostile territory," he informed us back at Holloway. "Disregard everything about Korea. Disregard World War II. This is unlike anything else. The adversary here doesn't occupy ground, doesn't engage in set-piece battles we can anticipate. They select when and where to fight, and they're exceptionally skilled at it." He established his command post directly center of the LZ, a calculated choice that positioned him in the most hazardous location, but provided him the optimal view of the entire battlefield. His radio operators gathered around him, the multiple antennas rendering them priority targets for anyone observing from the jungle. By 12:30 hours, we had approximately 400 men on the ground. The Hueys maintained their arrival, that distinctive whop-whop of their rotors becoming the soundtrack to everything that ensued. Additional soldiers, ammunition, water, medical supplies. Each bird remained less than 30 seconds on the ground, pilots understanding that a stationary helicopter was a vulnerable helicopter. The jungle was silent, too silent, stated Sergeant Diaz, who'd spent sufficient time in country to comprehend that silence signified attention, signified eyes observing, signified preparation. The customary sounds, birds, insects, monkeys traversing through the canopy, had ceased. The jungle was holding its breath. "They're here," Diaz stated, not an inquiry, a declaration. "They've been observing us since the initial bird touched down. They're counting, evaluating, determining." Staff Sergeant Palmer Hutchison, a Georgia native who'd hunted deer since he was 8, was on point for 2nd Platoon's patrol beyond the LZ perimeter. He'd volunteered, mentioned something about understanding how to interpret forest signs. He moved like he was back in the woods outside Macon, interpreting broken twigs and disturbed soil the way city kids read street signs. At 13:20 hours, his patrol encountered them. The initial shots were single cracks that sliced through the humid air like someone striking concrete with a ruler. Not the wild spray of ambush fire, but disciplined, aimed shots from positions we couldn't observe. Hutchison's voice transmitted over the radio, composed despite the circumstances. "Contact. Enemy soldiers in khaki uniforms, taking fire from multiple positions, requesting support." Then the world detonated into noise. The AK-47 possesses a distinctive sound, deeper and more resonant than the M16's higher-pitched crack. You could hear them operating in teams, overlapping fields of fire, covering each other with the precision of professional soldiers who'd trained together for months or years. These weren't farmers with rifles distributed last week. These were regulars of the North Vietnamese Army, the 66th Regiment of the People's Army of Vietnam, veterans who'd been fighting for independence since the French War. Our M16s responded, their faster cyclic rate generating a different rhythm, lighter, almost frantic compared to the deliberate hammer of Kalashnikovs. The sound rolled across the clearing like competing orchestras, each performing its own lethal symphony. Sergeant Ernie Savage, attached to our unit as an advisor, had fought in Korea. He'd witnessed Chinese human wave attacks at the Chosin Reservoir, had survived Porkchop Hill, carried scars, physical and psychological, that made him appear older than his 41 years. He dropped to the ground beside me as rounds snapped overhead, that supersonic crack that signifies bullets passing close enough to part your hair. "They're not farmers with rifles, kid," he stated, his voice remarkably composed for a man lying in dirt while machine and gunfire chewed up the earth around us. These are soldiers, genuine soldiers. This is going to become very dire, very rapidly. He was accurate. Lieutenant Colonel Moore was already on multiple radios simultaneously, coordinating responses with a velocity that suggested he'd war-gamed precisely this scenario. Artillery fire missions to batteries at landing zone Falcon 10 miles away, air support requests to Pleiku Air Base, calls for additional helicopter lifts to transport in the remainder of the battalion. Broken Arrow, he transmitted using the code for American unit in imminent danger of being overrun. It was the ultimate call for assistance, a signal that brought every available asset in theater racing toward our position. Within 7 minutes, F-100 Super Sabre jets were inbound from Bien Hoa. Within 12 minutes, artillery rounds were screaming overhead to impact in the jungle beyond our perimeter. The first artillery salvo landed like the fist of God pounding the earth. The 105mm howitzer rounds detonated in the jungle with flat percussive cracks that you sensed in your chest cavity, the shock waves creating pressure changes that made your ears pop. Trees splintered, earth erupted skyward. The concussions rolled across the clearing like physical things you could lean against. But the NVA fire didn't diminish. Captain Tony Nadal, commanding Alpha Company, was engaged heavily on the southern edge of the perimeter. His voice over the radio was clipped, professional, but you could detect the strain underneath. They're maneuvering, utilizing fire and movement, professional infantry tactics. They understand what they're doing. Private First Class Curtis Mitchell from 2nd Platoon had been a hunter in Montana before the Army. He'd grown up tracking elk in the Bitterroot Mountains, could interpret terrain like most people read newspapers. He was positioned behind a fallen log on the perimeter's edge, firing controlled bursts at muzzle flashes in the jungle. "They're utilizing spider holes," he called to Sergeant Diaz. "Firing, dropping down, moving through tunnels, emerging somewhere else. We're shooting at phantoms." The spider holes were a revelation to those of us new to Vietnam, pre-positioned fighting positions connected by shallow tunnels, camouflaged with vegetation that rendered them invisible until someone fired from them. The NVA could appear, shoot, vanish, and reappear 20 m away in seconds. It was like combating an enemy that could teleport. Specialist Galen Bungum, a radio operator whose job kept him next to Colonel Moore, was monitoring multiple frequencies simultaneously. He could hear the battalion net, the artillery net, the air support net, all overlapping in a chaos of calls and responses that somehow transformed into coherent understanding. "Fast movers inbound 90 seconds, Bungum called using the term for jet aircraft. "They're carrying napalm and high explosive. Colonel wants smoke marking friendlies." Purple smoke grenades began detonating around our perimeter, their distinctive violet clouds marking American positions for pilots who'd be traveling at 300 knots, attempting to distinguish friend from foe in terrain that appeared identical from the air. The F-100s arrived low, so low you could observe ordnance hanging under their wings, could observe the pilots in their cockpits, focused on the task at hand. The first jet released its napalm canisters at what appeared like treetop level, the silver cylinders tumbling through the air with an almost lazy rotation before impacting in the jungle 200 meters from our position. The napalm explosion was unlike anything else. Not a simple detonation, but a rolling wall of orange and black that spread across the jungle canopy like liquid fire. The heat struck seconds later, a wave of superheated air that extracted the moisture from your eyes and throat, that made you gasp for cooler air that wasn't available. The roar was continuous, a freight train sound that drowned out everything else. Trees ignited like matches. Bamboo thickets exploded from the heat, the hollow sections of bamboo expanding rapidly and bursting with sounds like gunshots. The vegetation that had provided cover for the NVA became their adversary, burning with intensity that created its own wind patterns, extracting oxygen from the air. But even napalm didn't stop them all. The NVA had learned tactics fighting the French, who'd use used napalm extensively. They understood to dig deep, to cover fighting positions, to wait out the fire. When the flames died down, they resumed firing, though with less intensity, their numbers reduced, but their determination unshaken. Corporal Andy Garcia from 3rd Platoon had been an auto mechanic in East LA before the draft. He was our M60 machine gunner, a job that combined high responsibility with even higher casualty rates. The M60 made you a priority target, its distinctive sound drawing fire like moths to flame. Garcia didn't care. He'd established his gun behind a termite mound that provided cover and was feeding belts through it with methodical precision. "They're probing," he called to his squad leader. "Testing our positions, searching for weak points. This isn't the main attack yet." He was correct. The NVA were conducting reconnaissance by fire, standard military practice, where you shoot at suspected positions to determine enemy locations and strength. They were learning our dispositions, counting our automatic weapons, measuring response times, all while we burned through ammunition dealing with what was essentially intelligence gathering. By 1500 hours, the temperature had climbed past 95°. The humidity was probably 80%. The combination was debilitating, sapping strength, making every movement feel like wading through honey. Canteens were running low. The initial helicopter loads hadn't included enough water because nobody expected sustained combat. Doc Thompson was already treating heat casualties alongside combat wounds. Private Daniel Boone, his actual name, something he'd endured jokes about since basic training, had collapsed from heat exhaustion while carrying ammunition. Thompson had him in the shade, such as it was, forcing water down his throat while simultaneously treating a nearby soldier who'd taken shrapnel from an RPG that had landed short of its target. "We need more water," Thompson called to the company commander. "We're going to have men down from heat before bullets get them." The helicopters responded, bringing in water cans on the next lift. But landing a helicopter at X-ray was becoming increasingly dangerous. The NVA had brought up 51 caliber machine guns, heavy weapons capable of bringing down a Huey with a single burst. The pilots were taking fire on every approach, making landing runs through streams of tracer fire that appeared like deadly light shows. Warrant Officer Bruce Crandall, who'd brought my platoon in that morning, made 14 runs into X-ray that afternoon. His Huey took multiple hits, hydraulic fluid spraying in the cockpit, rounds punching through the thin aluminum skin, one bullet passing between him and his co-pilot close enough to tear both their Nomex flight suits. He kept flying. Captain Ed Freeman, another Huey pilot who'd been flying since Korea, brought in ammunition when other pilots refused. The NVA fire was so heavy that his crew chief and door gunner both recommended aborting. Freeman's response was simple. "Those men need ammunition. We're going in." He made his approach through a stream of tracers that appeared like a laser light show, landed in the LZ for 30 seconds while soldiers frantically unloaded crates of M16 magazines and M60 belts, then pulled pitch and got out through the same wall of fire. His Huey landed back at base with over 50 bullet holes. He'd fly again the next day. As afternoon stretched toward evening, the NVA attacks increased in intensity. They were committed now, had decided that destroying this American unit was worth the casualties. Intelligence officers would later estimate that we were facing 3 full battalions of the 66th NVA Regiment, over 2,000 soldiers, maybe more. Lieutenant Rick Rescorla, a British-born platoon leader who'd served in the British Army before joining the US forces, was coordinating defense on the western edge of the perimeter. He was singing Cornish folk songs between fire missions, his strong baritone voice carrying across the battlefield in moments when firing slackened. It was bizarre and beautiful, and somehow perfectly appropriate, a man staring at death and choosing music as his response. "We come from the land of ice and snow, from the midnight sun where the hot springs flow," he sang, his M16 firing controlled bursts between verses. The men around him took strength from his composure, his refusal to show fear, even as NVA soldiers advanced to within hand grenade range. Staff Sergeant Robert L. Jemison, commanding a weapons squad, had set up a killing zone in front of his position using interlocking fields of fire from 2 M60 machine guns. He'd learned the Technique in advanced infantry training. Practiced it in exercises. Never imagined he'd need it for real. Now, as NVA soldiers emerged from the jungle in squad-sized elements, his careful preparation paid off. "Wait for it," he called to his gunners. "Let them get close. 40 me at 30. Now." Both M60s opened up simultaneously, their tracers creating a web of fire that caught the NVA soldiers in the open. The results were catastrophic for the attackers. Men fell, others dove for cover. A few made it back to the jungle, but the attack broke, momentum lost, the survivors pulling back to regroup. This pattern repeated throughout the afternoon. Attack, repulse, brief pause, attack again. The NVA were relentless, accepting casualties that would have broken most military units, replacing losses with fresh troops, maintaining pressure even as their dead accumulated in the elephant grass. Night fell at 1830 hours, sudden and absolute the way it does in the tropics. One moment there was daylight, the next there was darkness, relieved only by burning jungle where napalm had struck, by the red glow of tracer rounds, by occasional parachute flares dropped by Air Force C-47 spooky gunships orbiting overhead. The darkness changed everything. Sounds became magnified. Every snap of a twig, potentially an enemy soldier approaching. Every rustle of grass, possibly the beginning of an assault. The NVA preferred night attacks, were trained for them, had experience fighting in darkness that most American soldiers lacked. Colonel Moore ordered full alert, 50% awake at all times, no one more than an arm's length from their weapon. The command post became a cluster of radio operators hunched over glowing frequencies, their faces lit by instrument dials, speaking in whispers into handsets, while Moore orchestrated a defensive battle that was being monitored in real time at MACV headquarters in Saigon. The first night assault came at 21:45 hours. No preliminary bombardment, no warning, just suddenly, NVA soldiers were among us, running upright, firing from the hip, screaming slogans we didn't understand. They came in waves of 30 or 40 men, targeting specific sectors, trying to break through in concentrated assaults that leveraged their numerical advantage. Sergeant Savage was firing his M16 on full automatic, something we'd been trained never to do because it wasted ammunition. But there was no such thing as wasting ammunition when enemy soldiers were 10 mess away and closing. His magazine emptied in 3 seconds. He reloaded, muscle memory taking over, conscious thought abandoned for pure trained reaction. Private Nakayama's position took the brunt of the first assault. He was firing so rapidly his M16 began to jam, the chamber heating up, rounds failing to extract properly. He cleared it, resumed firing, cleared it again. When his rifle finally jammed irreparably, he picked up an AK-47 from a fallen NVA soldier and continued fighting with enemy weapons. The M60 machine guns fired continuously, their barrels glowing red in the darkness like demonic eyes. Assistant gunners poured water on them, the liquid evaporating instantly with sharp hissing sounds, steam mixing with gun smoke to create an atmosphere that was part fog, part hell. Corporal Garcia's M60 fired over 3,000 rounds that night, far exceeding its designed operational limits. The barrel should have melted. The receiver should have cracked from heat stress. It kept functioning, kept firing, kept cutting down attackers who showed a courage that inspired respect, even while we killed them. The grenade exchanges were terrifying in their intimate violence. You'd hear the metallic clunk of a Chinese stick grenade landing nearby, have maybe 2 seconds to locate it in the darkness, to either throw it back or take cover. Sometimes you had time, sometimes you didn't. The explosions were small supernovas in the darkness, brief flashes that revealed faces caught in the moment of detonation. American, Vietnamese, all sharing that final instant of terror. Specialist 4th Class Thompson was everywhere, moving between wounded men with a disregard for his own safety that bordered on suicidal. Medics were non-combatants in theory, protected by Geneva Conventions. In practice, practice, the NVA targeted them deliberately, knowing that killing medics lowered American morale and reduced survival rates. Thompson didn't care. He crawled between positions, dragging wounded men to safer ground, applying pressure bandages, starting IVs, administering morphine, his hands steady despite the chaos. When a mortar round landed near him, killing the man he was treating and wounding Thompson himself, he simply bandaged his own wounds and continued working. The artillery support was constant, a drumroll of outgoing fire that never stopped. Forward observers like Lieutenant Bill Riddell were calling in missions danger close, rounds landing within 75 meters of American positions. The procedure for danger close fire required higher approval, but Moore had pre-approved everything. If they need it, shoot it, he'd ordered. We'll accept the risk. The risk was real. Short rounds occasionally fell within the perimeter, friendly fire casualties adding to the toll, but the artillery kept the NVA from massing for overwhelming attacks, kept them dispersed, forced them to advance in smaller groups that could be engaged by small arms fire. The C-47 gunships orbiting overhead were medieval in their effectiveness. Puff the Magic Dragon, soldiers called them, adapted cargo planes mounting multiple miniguns that could fire 6,000 rounds per minute. When they fired, it looked like a solid stream of fire connecting sky to ground, a laser made of tracer rounds. Where that stream touched, everything died. But they had to be careful. The enemy was close, sometimes mixed in with American positions. The gunships could only engage targets identified with certainty, marked with colored smoke or tracer fire. Despite restrictions, they fired over 40,000 rounds that night, their streams of fire creating temporary daylight that revealed the battlefield in stark, horrifying detail. Dawn on November 15th revealed the true cost of the night. Bodies lay scattered across the LZ and into the surrounding jungle. American and NVA mixed together in the democracy of death. The elephant grass was flattened, torn, burned, soaked with blood and dew in equal measure. Spent brass casings carpeted the ground, inches deep in some places, creating a golden carpet that crunched underfoot like gravel. The smell was overwhelming. Cordite, napalm, burning vegetation, human waste, blood and something else. The sweet, rotten smell of death, beginning in tropical heat. It was a smell that would live in nostrils and memory forever, instantly recognizable years later, trigger for nightmares that time wouldn't diminish. We'd held barely. The NVA had thrown everything at us, and we'd survived through a combination of firepower, courage, and sheer stubborn refusal to die. But the cost was visible in faces around me. Exhaustion, shock, the 1,000-yard stare of men who'd seen too much too fast. Colonel Moore used the daylight to consolidate, to count casualties, to prepare for the next attack that everyone knew was coming. The helicopters resumed their runs, bringing in reinforcements from Charlie Company, evacuating the most seriously wounded, resupplying ammunition and water. The battlefield medical evacuation was a process that combined heroism and horror. The wounded were staged near the LZ, arranged by urgency. Those who could wait, those who needed evacuation soon, those who needed it immediately, and those for whom no evacuation would matter. Doc Thompson and the other medics made these decisions in seconds, triage choices that would haunt them forever, choosing who lived and who died based on calculations too terrible to dwell upon. The Huey medevac ships came in despite fire, despite danger, despite common sense that said landing was suicide. Dust off was their call sign, a term that became synonymous with courage beyond measure. The pilots and crew chiefs exposed themselves completely during loading, helping lift stretchers, taking fire without returning it because they were medical flights, protected in theory by conventions that the NVA sometimes observed and sometimes didn't. Major Bruce Crandall and Captain Ed Freeman made repeated runs throughout the day, far beyond what regulations required scared beyond what prudence suggested, beyond what anyone had the right to expect. They flew because soldiers needed help, because abandoning wounded was unthinkable, because their personal honor wouldn't allow any other choice. Years later, both would receive the Medal of Honor for actions at X-ray. The citations would use terms like conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty. The men they saved would use simpler terms. They came when nobody else would. The second day brought more fighting, though the pattern changed. The NVA was still attacking, but with less coordination, their losses beginning to affect their command structure. They'd taken massive casualties, hundreds dead, probably more wounded, but they hadn't broken, hadn't retreated, hadn't given up the idea of annihilating the American unit. Lieutenant Rescorla continued his singing, switching from folk songs to army marching cadences. We're airborne rangers, living on danger, 100 men going to war. Guts and danger, airborne rangers. His men joined in, their voices ragged but defiant, singing even while loading magazines, singing while calling fire missions, singing because the alternative was screaming or crying or giving in to the terror that lived just below the surface. The fighting continued through the second day, through the second night, into the third day. The battle that was supposed to last hours stretched into nearly a week. More units were committed. Alpha Company of the 2nd Battalion, Bravo Company, Charlie Company. The helicopters never stopped, turning X-ray into a logistics hub that consumed supplies at rates no one had predicted. The M16 rifle problems became critical on the second day. The rifles were jamming constantly, failures to extract becoming so common that soldiers were carrying cleaning rods to punch out stuck cases in the middle of firefights. Men died working on malfunctioning rifles while enemy soldiers advanced. The problem was traced to ammunition loaded with wrong powder, ball powder instead of stick powder, and inadequate cleaning kits. The powder residue combined with dust and heat created a fouling that the rifle couldn't handle. The M16 required maintenance levels impossible in combat conditions. Soldiers began picking up AK-47s from fallen NVA troops, using enemy weapons that functioned flawlessly despite mud, water, and abuse. The AK was less accurate, less sophisticated, but infinitely more reliable. It could be buried in mud, pulled out, and fired without cleaning. The comparison humiliated Army ordnance officers and killed American soldiers who trusted that their equipment was the best in the world. The M60 machine guns, by contrast, proved themselves repeatedly. Despite overheating, despite firing rates that exceeded design specifications, they kept functioning. Gunners developed personal relationships with their weapons, naming them, talking to them, attributing personalities to machines that kept them alive through mechanical reliability. By November 17th, the NVA had largely withdrawn. They'd achieved part of their objective, proving they could stand against American forces, inflicting casualties, demonstrating that this war wouldn't be won easily or quickly. They'd paid a terrible price. Over 1,300 confirmed dead around X-ray, probably another 1,000 wounded. American casualties were 79 killed, more than 100 wounded seriously enough for evacuation. For a military accustomed to overwhelming victories, with minimal losses, these numbers represented a sobering reality about the war ahead. The helicopters finally lifted us out on November 18th. The flight back to landing zone Columbus felt different from the flight in. We were different, quieter, older, carrying knowledge that changed how we looked at the world. The jungle passing beneath us looked the same, vegetation already swallowing the scars of battle. I survived Ia Drang and 11 more months in country, made it home, built a life, tried to forget. But those 7 days never left. They live in sounds, helicopter rotors, AK-47 fire, the screams of wounded. They live in smells, gun smoke, napalm, death in tropical heat. They live in dreams that wake you gasping, reaching for a rifle that isn't there. The lessons of Ia Drang should have ended the war. They proved that the NVA would fight, would die in numbers we couldn't sustain politically, would outlast American will through patience measured in decades. But lessons learned in jungles don't translate to briefing rooms in Washington. The war continued for 8 more years, consuming a generation, dividing a nation, achieving nothing, that justified its cost. The soldiers who fought at X-Ray, American and Vietnamese, carry those days differently, but with equal weight. We faced death together, showed courage that transcends politics, survived horrors that mark you forever. The Vietnamese were defending their homeland, fighting for unification and independence. We were defending an idea, fighting for reasons that grew less clear with each passing month. Neither side was wrong in their bravery. Both sides were right in their courage. War is complicated in ways that don't fit neatly into winner-loser narratives. It breaks some, hardens others, kills many, and changes all who survive it. The jungle has reclaimed landing zone X-ray now. The scars have healed, the craters filled, the blood washed away. Only memory remains, carried by men growing old on 2 continents, united by violence that shaped everything after. This is their story, our story, a tale of courage and sacrifice that deserves remembering even when the war remains controversial. The whispers of Ia Drang echo still. They speak of limits and costs, of bravery on both sides, of young men facing death with a grace that humbles those who come after. They remind us that some prices are too high regardless of outcome, that some scars never heal, that some memories never fade. The jungle spoke in whispers. We should have listened,